So during this meeting, what will we be doing? We will be going over what are the eligible client populations and some of the eligible things you can spend money on if you get a COC grant. We'll be giving a quick overview of just a few of the major COC grant requirements. And we'll be reviewing a typical COC funding application timeline. We might be able to discuss a few project design decision points, right? If you think you're interested in applying for COC funding at some point, we might get into some stuff that will be relevant for, deciding what kind of project and who you want to serve, things like that, but we won't dig deep into that probably. And we might be able to provide some resources to help with new project planning. If you all have questions, we might be able to follow up with some of that. We will not be providing a full scope COC grant compliance training. We do that. We have recorded COC grant compliance trainings that we can direct you to, and we do a whole set of them every year, but that won't be in this training. We won't be going over the application process in great detail, and we won't ever, in this meeting or at any other time, be giving you advice about what to say specifically in your application to get points. But outside of this meeting, we may cover some of those other things. So this year, we are going to be offering 2 new intro to COC sessions that we have not offered in the past. One is an introduction to COC project design, where we will be going over some of the requirements and limitations of how you can put together a project with this funding and really hit on the major decision points that you would have to think through in order to submit a project for this funding. We'll also be offering an introduction to COC applications, where we'll cover the local application and what to expect in that. We'll cover the federal funding application, which is a whole separate form. And we'll talk about navigating the federal application system called eSNAPs, right? So if you're trying to decide whether you want to apply for COC funding, you may not have that figured out at the end of this meeting. You certainly won't have the answer to all of your questions, but know that we are going to be offering these 2 additional sessions that will get into some more detail and might help you with that decision. And then to go over the agenda for today. So we'll start with a quick intro to the COC program and to the continuum of care, the concept itself. We'll talk about who you can serve. We'll talk a little bit about what project types you can apply for. We'll talk about what you can use the funding to pay for, what the eligible costs are, a few other funding requirements, and then we'll look at the COC program local competition process very briefly. Again, this is a lot of material. I am going to try to give us a quick break in the middle of the hour and a half that we have. It'll be a quick human needs break of about 3 minutes. I do want to prioritize getting all of the information to you all, however, so recognize that this is recorded, and if you do need to step away for some reason, we'll keep going. And we'll make sure you get the recording afterwards. So we'll try for a quick break, but I also want to make sure we get all of the information out. So I'll be judging the time as we go. Deep breath. And are there any questions so far? Okay. So let's go. Thank you so much for the no. That's really, really helpful feedback for me. I appreciate that in the chat. So let's dive into this intro section here. Some of these slides are going to look familiar to those of you who were able to watch the pre-meeting video. What is the Continuum of Care program? It is a federal funding stream that focuses on funding for permanent housing projects that serve people who are unhoused or who are exiting houselessness. So this funding stream is administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? So they control and also award the funding. Ultimately, however, the rules for this competition are first set by the US Congress. This is funding that is authorized by Congress. So often when you're sitting in COC meetings or we're talking about the Nofa, sometimes things come up that are a little bit above HUD's pay grade even, and we have to wait for congressional approval of. But our immediate sort of administrator of this funding is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The funding is administered in an annual competition. So when we talk about the funding competition, the local competition, the COC program funding competition, that is an annual thing. That is, we're going to talk a little bit more about as we go through the presentation, but this is something that if you do apply for a COC grant, this competition is an ongoing annual thing that all COC grantees have to participate in each year if they want to renew their funding. But what is a continuum of care? We know Continuum of Care program, the COC program, is a federal funding stream, but we talk about the Continuum of Care. The title slide of this presentation said Santa Clara County Continuum of Care. So what is that? Continuum of Care is the phrase that HUD and now most communities use to refer to a local collaborative, a local group of community members, of housing and shelter and service providers, of funders that come together specifically for the purpose of submitting an application for Continuum of Care funding. So with the COC funding stream, HUD decided that it does not want to make the individual decisions about what a community needs, right? What are the highest priority projects in a community? Does Tucson need more permanent supportive housing or more rapid rehousing? HUD says, we don't know. We want you as a community to come together and plan together and decide what the best uses of this funding are. And therefore, HUD requires that each community identify itself as a continuum of care and collectively submit a single application to HUD for this COC funding. So essentially, the reason the continuum of care exists as a continuum of care is to submit this funding application. But because a continuum of care exists and because of its important role in most federal funding to end homelessness, the COC is also usually, and in Santa Clara County, is in the position of setting funding priorities and setting some system policies. Continuum of care is set up with a clear governance structure. So every COC has COC membership. In Santa Clara County Continuum of Care, membership is very open. There are very few, if any, actual responsibilities or requirements placed on members. And we want to make sure that the bar to being a member of the COC is very low. So essentially, in order to be a member of the COC, you participate in the COC, you attend a meeting, you sign up for the COC's mailing list. And that means you are a stakeholder in the COC, you are a member of this collaborative community group, and show up to meetings and participate in this setting of funding priorities and system policies. The COC membership approves the COC's governance charter. And the governance charter lays out how is the work of the COC going to be moved forward. The governance charter lays out how the COC board is selected. The COC board is the sort of final decision maker and policy setter in a lot of situations. And that COC board is determined by the governance charter. So how those members are selected is determined by the governance charter. The COC board can and does delegate that final decision-making authority to various other entities in the COC. Sometimes that is a work group or a committee. So if you hear about the Coordinated Assessment Work Group in Santa Clara County, or the Performance Management Work Group, or the Nofo Committee, all of those are work groups and committees of the Continuum of Care. The COC board can also delegate responsibility to the collaborative applicant. Every continuum of care has to have a collaborative applicant. That is the legal entity, the organization that hits submit on our funding application when we send it to HUD, and also has the responsibility of making sure the funding application happens. So as KJ said, in Santa Clara County Continuum of Care, the collaborative applicant is the Office of Supportive Housing. That just means the Office of Supportive Housing has to make sure that we apply for the funding, that we have a process, and that process is running. I mentioned work groups because work groups and meetings and committee meetings are a really important part of how the Santa Clara County Continuum of Care operates. So I've listed some of the main meetings and work groups that happen in our Continuum of Care throughout the year. All of these meetings are open attendance, right? I sometimes get emails saying, can I just come sit in on the Nofo Committee? Of course, yes, please. Everybody is welcome to all of these meetings. All of the work groups and the committees are open attendance. They don't have set membership. And we really encourage folks to come and get involved, particularly after having this intro, because now you'll have concepts for all of the words you'll hear thrown around at these meetings. Okay, but how does the funding actually work? So we know that Continuum of Care funding comes in one-year grants. We know that there's an annual competition, and we know that the community as a whole submits one application to HUD for funding. So how does that work? In fact, HUD does not award money to the Continuum of Care directly, right? The Continuum of Care as this collaborative body never holds the money at this, in the way that the funding works in our community now. The money is granted directly from HUD to each of these individual agencies. The role of the Continuum of Care is to compile all of the individual funding applications from each of these agencies and to forward them on to HUD and say, these are the applications that our community has selected to submit to you. And HUD will respond by saying, excellent, thank you so much. We're going to fund these selected projects, and we are not going to fund these other applications that you submitted. And then HUD will enter into those grant agreements directly with the agencies. That will, this will be made a lot more clear, and your role in that in the introduction to the COC project applications session that we're putting on. So we've gone over what Continuum of Care is very quickly. We've gone over the basics of just what is this funding stream. Are there any questions before we move on to eligible populations and who you can serve? I think I went over just a little too quickly. Anything that didn't make sense? Oh, that's a great question, Trudy, in the chat. So the question is, the COC gets some administrative costs awarded though, right? It's a great question. The collaborative applicant, so in our case, the Office of Supportive Housing, can apply for what's called a planning grant. This planning grant is non-competitive. So it does not, it's not part of the competitive pot of funding that grantees can, organizations in the community can apply for. It is a separate special pot of funding that HUD sets aside and says, okay, each community, you can ask for up to this much money in planning. And the only organization that can apply for that planning grant is the collaborative applicant. And then the uses of that planning grant is to do things like, well, so to do community planning processes, to support COC support staff, make sure that all the work groups are staffed and keep working and all of that stuff. So yes, great question. That is some planning money that goes directly to the collaborative applicant. That's a great question. So KJ, in the chat, does the planning grant include contracts with home base?
Yes, it does. So right now our planning grant is used to, as Eli mentioned, support sort of our community plan implementation and processes, our development of the collaborative application, which Home-Based helps with. This meeting is a good example. Home-Base's work to support this meeting is included in the contract and included in the COC planning grant. It also includes things like we use our planning grant also to provide stipends to folks with lived experience to participate in COC work groups and things, as well as our newly formed youth action board. So it's fairly broad in terms of what we use it for, and some OSH staff time if it's directed towards the larger COC activities, not our individual grants.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, moving on to the very exciting question of, yes, yeah, true. I think that's a really great point to make, that HUD acknowledges that it places a lot of requirements on a continuum of care and systems that it has to operate and planning that it has to do. So it does set aside this funding specifically for the planning piece. Yeah. Who can you serve with continuum of care program funding? So we're going to go over the general definitions that HUD uses for this particular funding stream. We have two sources for these definitions. There is a final rule, a regulation that HUD published called the Defining Homeless Final Rule that defines the term homeless for purposes of COC program funding. And then second, we have Defining Chronically Homeless Final Rule, which defines the term chronically homeless for purposes of COC program funding. The Defining Homeless Final Rule has 4 different categories in it, 4 paragraphs of this definition that lay out 4 separate categories of people or criteria that someone could meet in order to meet the definition of homeless. We are only going to be talking about categories 1, 2, and 4 because category 3 isn't in use. No COC that we know of is authorized to serve people in this category, so we're going to ignore it. We also want to recognize that there are other federal definitions of homelessness. There are definitions used in medical funding and those environments, and there are definitions that are used in schools for the McKinney-Vento regulations and those requirements in funding. Those federal definitions are very important, but they are not used for the continuum of care program funding, so we're not going to talk about those. So the primary, I would say the most common, just by numbers, definition that is used in continuum of care program funding is that category 1 of the definition of what homeless means to HUD. Category 1 covers people who are sleeping or staying in places that are not intended for people to live in. The phrase HUD uses is places not meant for human habitation. So that includes people who are sleeping outside, in a car, in another vehicle that is not intended to be lived in an RV or an abandoned building that's not hooked up to utilities in most cases, sleeping in an emergency shelter for people who are unhoused. That would definitely be a situation that fits in category 1. And then there's also included in this category people who are in a jail or hospital or other institutional settings for less than 90 days. And before they entered that institutional setting, they were in one of these other situations. So if someone was sleeping outside and then had to stay, it was in a hospital for 3 weeks, they would still be considered in category 1. However, if someone is sleeping outside and they're in a hospital for over 90 days, when they exit that hospital, they are no longer considered part of category 1. So this is one of the most common definitions of unhoused. Category 1 of HUD's definition does not include people who are couch surfing, people who are doubled up, people who are living in hotel rooms that they are paying for. And a lot of other situations, in fact, that we as a community might recognize as either unhoused or severely housing unstable and in need of housing supports. We don't set this definition, HUD does, and under these definitions for this funding stream, those situations are not eligible. So if someone is paying for a hotel room, they are not homeless under category 1. But we have some other definitions. So depending on project type, we do serve, or we do see projects serving people in the 2 other categories of the homeless definition. So first, category 4. This includes people who are actively fleeing domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual assault, stalking, basically people who are fleeing violence. There is a specific definition of what it means to be fleeing. So fleeing includes someone had to leave their primary place of residence because it was unsafe for one of these reasons. They don't have another place that is safe to live, and they don't have resources or an existing support network in order to allow them to obtain that for themselves on their own. So they're fleeing violence, and they really need help in order to find a safe, permanent place to stay. And then the other category that we often see, or we sometimes see being served, is people who are at imminent risk of meeting HUD's category 1 definition, basically, at imminent risk of homelessness. So people who will have to leave their current residence within 14 days and do not have other resources. So that could be that someone has been evicted and they have to get out of their unit within less than 14 days. There are other situations that this might apply to, right? So one of the things about category 2 is it can provide a little bit of flexibility in that area of, like, someone is not unhoused right now, but we know that they are for sure that they're going to be unhoused 4 days from now. So we need to get them enrolled in a project. Category 2 is, I would say, specifically one of the categories of the homeless definition that we see coming in and out of play. Each notice of funding opportunity, each notice that HUD releases saying that our money is available for this year, right, for that annual competition, lays out specifically the categories and the definitions that it's going to be offering money to serve each year. So in 1 year, it might say, okay, we're funding any project that's serving people in category 1 and nothing else. And the next year, it might say, okay, now your projects can serve anybody in category 1, category 2, or category 4. I would say that category 1 and category 4 are the most consistent, and we see category 2 coming in and out a little bit more. Thank you. So I have a question in the chat from Lisa asking about how long of a hotel stay. I think we're back at category 1 here. How long of a hotel stay would put someone, put a person to be considered not homeless under this definition? Overnight, 2 to 3 days. Yeah, so these definitions are about the night before. And that is the specific documentation of that gets really wonky. So it's technically, HUD talks about night before homelessness, meaning where were you sleeping last night? But there is a window where you can document that night before homelessness up to 14 days prior to enrollment in a project. So the answer to the question, Lisa, is we should get eligibility documentation training video for y'all, because the specific details of this are a lot more complicated than show on this slide. So yeah, it would depend on when those 2 to 3 nights were and what else you could document. Okay, I see a question in the chat or a comment in the chat, and I'm going to come back to that. And maybe Nicole, you can take a look at that. All right. So we've gone over categories 1, 2, and 4 of the definition of homeless. The second definition we talked about was the definition of chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness, let's see, for category 4. Yes, oh, great question. Thank you in the chat. The question is for category 4, can someone who is trying to flee and still living in the violent situation be considered category 4? Yes. Yeah, they can absolutely be considered category 4. I believe that that first part of the definition is that their primary residence is unsafe. I would have to look up the specific definition, but it does include people who are just need and want to leave. Yeah. Okay, looking at chronic homelessness. So this is another very key definition for specific types of projects that HUD offers. Chronic homelessness has 3 parts to it. In order to be considered chronically homeless, a person has to fall into these 3 criteria. One is that they are currently unhoused in one of those category 1 situations. If someone is currently unhoused because they fall into category 4 or category 2, they cannot meet the chronically homeless definition. We're talking about people who are currently unhoused in a category 1 situation. The second part of the chronic homeless definition is not only is someone currently unhoused, but they have a history of being unhoused in one of those category 1 situations for a total of at least 12 months. That can be the past 12 months consecutively, or it can be cumulative 12 months in 4 episodes over 3 years. So you can start to see that this documentation of eligibility for chronic homelessness could get quite complicated, because not only are you determining that a person is unhoused currently, you have to look back over maybe the past 12 months and establish where that person was living, but potentially over the past 3 years to find those 4 episodes of someone being unhoused. And the third criteria for chronic homelessness is the person must have a diagnosed disabling condition that prevents them from maintaining housing stability independently. So the definition of a disabling condition is also provided in HUD's regulations. I'm not going to go into that definition here, but the complexity of this is why we provide trainings on eligibility documentation. As I said, we do have a training that's recorded on the different eligibility criteria and how to document it. That is really, really key for anybody who's going to be operating or working as a staff person in a COC funded project, is to have that training. Okay. One question that we often get is, can I specialize in a subpopulation? Can I choose a population to focus on that where everybody does fit the homeless eligibility criteria that HUD sets, but I would just want to focus on a specific population? Typically, yes, with some restrictions. So we want to be very aware of anti-discrimination laws. For example, it is prohibited to focus on people who have a specific disability, because that means you're excluding people based on the type of disabling condition that they have. But you can limit your population to generally people who have a disabling condition, but then you have to serve anybody who's referred who has any disabling condition. And then in the event that there is no one else in the community who meets your specific population focus, which is highly unlikely, but we have to say it, say all of the youth in the community have been housed, then your project would have to switch to accepting people who are not youth, even if that's your target population. So some common special populations, these are pretty much the special populations that we see. Youth 18 to 24, families with children can be a specific target population. Survivors of domestic violence, so people who are fleeing. Veterans, people with disabling conditions as a general category. These are very common special populations. This is another piece that we will talk about much more specifically in the Intro to COC project design. How do you choose a special population? What are the things to avoid about, being in a picking a special population, and how do you make those choices as best fit your project design? Okay, I'm gonna deep breath and pause one more time. Any other questions about the definitions of homelessness or population eligibility and restricting your population? Okay. So I'm gonna say, yeah, we're gonna keep going a little bit. Okay. Last very important point about who you can serve, right? We've talked about general eligibility categories. How can you set up your project to serve a specific population? Who might you be referred, right? What referrals might you get? But another very important point about who you would be serving with a COC project, with a COC program grant, is that all of your referrals, every single person that you serve in your project would come through the coordinated assessment system. Right? So for continuum of care funded projects, you cannot enroll enroll clients through any other route aside from coordinated assessment. This is a requirement of the funding stream. So for folks who might not be super familiar with coordinated assessment, I'm going to go through generally the pieces of coordinated assessment generally, and then relate that to what it looks like in Santa Clara County. So coordinated assessment involves identifying people who need housing supports. So there is the access portion where we, as a community, as a system, try to identify as many people as possible, all of the people who need housing assistance. We try not to let anybody slip through the cracks in terms of access to housing. And then a coordinated assessment system has some way of assessing for each person what type of housing resource that the community has available is most likely to meet your need. And also, given that we have a very limited set of housing resources relative to that need, the coordinated assessment system does the job of prioritizing funding. Who is going to get a referral today when the referral is open, right? So coordinated assessment provides access, and then it assesses each person, and it goes, the system has a way of prioritizing so that each person is referred to the resource or the project that we think is most likely to meet their needs of all the things that are available, and the system makes that referral, right? So the key things about coordinated assessment are it needs to know everybody who needs housing support and is asking for housing help. And it needs to know all of the housing that is available so that it can create a streamlined system for connecting those two pieces, right? The people who need the housing support and the housing projects. The other big thing to note about coordinated assessment, especially in Santa Clara County right now, is that it is a perpetually imperfect system. And one of the things that one of our work groups, the coordinated assessment work group, is working on right now is reevaluating and considering a redesign of the coordinated assessment system in Santa Clara County. This is very exciting, and we encourage you all to check that out. I see Nicole nodding. She's key in that process. So the real specifics of how this works right now in Santa Clara County are, like, the coordinated assessment work group is a great venue to hear the conversations about that right now. But for you as a potential COC grantee, someone who might be interested in this funding, what would that mean for your project? Well, all of the clients that you serve would be referred through this coordinated assessment system, whatever it looks like at the time. Typically, you would notify the coordinated assessment system when you're going to have an opening in your project, when you're going to need a referral. The coordinated assessment system will get back to you and say, hey, this is our next person who needs your help. Go ahead and find them. You would locate that household, right? So you would get the name of the contact person for the household. You would get contact information. You would hopefully get, some pointers to people who had contact with the providers who had contact with the household. And it would be your responsibility to find that household in the community, and then to verify and document that the household is eligible, and then to enroll that client in your project. Any questions about coordinated assessment system and how it relates to a COC project? Appreciate the excellent acronym work going on in the chat.
Quick question. All this coordination is happening through HMIS, right?
Yes, it is how, well, a lot of it, in that, like all of the information about people who are assessed goes into HMIS. That information is held in HMIS. There are human beings, currently the matchmakers that are housed at the Office of Supportive Housing, who look at that information, who manage the lists of people, and who actually make the referrals. Does that make sense?
Yes. So for an agency to share that they have an opening, it would be through HMIS.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so in order to, KJ, in order to get a referral from coordinated assessment, you have to be in HMIS. Is that accurate?
The agency, yeah, the program would have to be in HMIS. Yeah, the referral is made, like the matchmaker would actually enter a program referral from somebody that's on the coordinated assessment or the community queue to an open slot in a program in HMIS.
Yeah, great clarifying question.
The only exception to that, sorry, is for programs that are serving survivors, which do not utilize HMIS. So that process works a little bit differently, but everybody else, it's done through HMIS.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, we're going to be talking about project types. HUD is very specific and fairly limited for this funding stream about the types of projects that it will fund. The first we're going to talk about is permanent supportive housing, PSH, permanent supportive housing. This is one of those acronyms that we just throw around a lot, I think. So if you hear PSH, it's permanent supportive housing. For COC funded permanent supportive housing, every client must have a disabling condition. That is a baseline, something that we expect to be true about COC funded permanent supportive housing always. And often, especially recently, this funding has been targeted to people who are chronically homeless. In the past 3 or 4 years, we've also seen a slightly expanded definition that I'm not going to go into today because it's very wonky, very detailed, and you don't need to know it until you're actually designing a project. But generally speaking, we can understand permanent supportive housing funding in recent years to be targeted towards a population that is chronically homeless or is very similar to that chronic homeless definition. In a permanent supportive housing project, the housing that is provided or the rental subsidy, right? It could be either a physical unit that is provided by the project, or it could be a rental assistance voucher or a subsidy, is provided indefinitely. There is no time limit. It is provided as long as that participant needs permanent supportive housing, which is often permanent for many folks. So the permanent part of this is the assistance is permanent. Case management, right, which is a person or a team that can coordinate care, can help a participant to have a housing plan, have a benefits plan, whatever type of plan they need to identify what that person's goals are and what resources in the community might help support that person, and then to connect the person to those resources. Case management is also provided indefinitely, as long as needed, with no time limit, for as long as the person is enrolled in that project. All right, so again, the supportive part of the permanent supportive housing is this case management piece that is also permanent. And then finally, a hugely important part of permanent supportive housing is connection to services. Services that help to stabilize a person in housing, services that support wellness. Specifically in permanent supportive housing, there is often a huge emphasis on medical and behavioral health supports, because every client who is enrolled will have a disabling condition. So it's very important that clients are connected to services that meet those needs. A project does not have to provide all of the required services for housing stability and wellness internally. A project could, but you don't have to. You don't have to have doctors on staff, for example. But what a project does have to do is have sufficient case management support to ensure that clients can identify their own needs and know what is available to meet those needs, and then support them to get connected to those resources. Okay, permanent supportive housing, the main key here is that all of these things will continue and they are not time limited. Rapid rehousing, another very common acronym, RRH. Oh, great question. Okay, in the chat. And I want to address this now because this is true of all COC project types. If a client refuses all services, could that lead to them losing their housing? And the answer is, in and of itself, refusing services cannot lead to a client losing their place in a COC funded project. So refusing to participate in services is not a reason that someone can be exited from a COC project. I could think of examples where a client not accessing services that would meet their real needs, their real practical needs, could lead to a situation in which a client gets exited, but that there cannot be a direct connection, right? You can't say, okay, if you're not going to show up to our case management, or if you're not going to attend your doctor's appointments or your therapy, then we can't serve you anymore. That is explicitly prohibited by HUD, or I guess by our community expectations. Is that responsive to your question? Is that clear? Great. Okay, the next project type, rapid rehousing. So an RRH, or rapid rehousing project, typically COC funded rapid rehousing targets category 1 or category 4, fleeing. But rapid rehousing is where we have seen HUD bringing in that category 2 imminent risk of losing your housing. Many clients, and so there is no requirement for rapid rehousing that clients have a disabling condition, but I want to call out that many and most clients that are referred to rapid rehousing in Santa Clara County are facing significant barriers to housing. So we want to emphasize that the support that folks need in rapid rehousing is intensive in a lot of cases. So you'll notice we're looking at the same 3 components here, right? We're going to look at housing support, we're going to look at case management, we're going to look at services. All 3 of those pieces need to be present for rapid rehousing as well. The differences are in the time limits. So for rapid rehousing, the rental subsidy is limited to a max of 24 months. And HUD expects that this rental subsidy will step down over the course of the client's participation in the project. The outside limit is 24 months. If you're interested in what CUC-funded rapid rehousing looks like in terms of typical lengths of time, I would encourage you could attend the performance management work group meetings and where we look at data, and you could chat to some of the rapid rehousing providers in the community. I know that it's rare for projects to have, at least in pre-COVID, for projects to have most clients staying 24 months. But I also know that lengths of stay are usually at least a year, if not longer, for these rapid rehousing projects. Case management is also time limited. So this funding allows for case management to continue up to 6 months past the end of that rental subsidy, but it is still time limited. So an important part of rapid rehousing is to for the client and the provider to recognize that this is necessarily time limited, which is why the connection to other supports outside of the project, to the services that are available in the community, is such a huge focus for rapid rehousing. So connections to those stabilizing supports in the community that are going to help someone maintain their housing stability after they're exited from the project. I see a couple other questions in the chat. I'll get through those in a second. There's one last project type I want to talk about, and that is the joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing project. This is relatively new. This has been around for the past about 4 years. And it combines rapid rehousing, which is what we just talked about, with transitional housing, meaning that this project has a transitional housing piece and it has a rapid rehousing piece. Transitional housing in HUD's definition is housing that is provided for up to 24 months, case management, and then service connections, right? How is this different? What's the difference between transitional housing and rapid rehousing? They're both time limited. They both provide housing support, case management, and service connections. The answer is really about where the client is during the project. During their participation in a transitional housing project, the client is living in a unit that is owned by the project, that's a transitional housing unit, and that the client will be expected to move out of at the end of the project. That's the typical transitional housing model. We have this house, it's got 4 rooms in it, or we have this apartment building, or we have this unit, and we're gonna house our transitional housing clients here while they're in the project, and before they leave, we're gonna help them find a place to move to that's permanent. Whereas rapid rehousing, while the client is in the project and being served, they are already in a permanent unit. That the expectation and the goal is they're gonna stay in that unit when program support ramps down. Right? So transitional housing versus rapid rehousing, very similar concepts, very similar populations, but in rapid rehousing, someone is actually in a permanent housing unit and the goal is to keep them there and stabilize them there. Yes, okay. Great question about joint THRH projects. So both include 24 months, or can you do separate of 24 months of each? The answer to that, I'm fairly confident, is it's a total of 24 months. And it can be, the client gets to choose always, right? One of the things that HUD is very explicit about for this project type is it's the client choice whether they start out in transitional housing or in rapid rehousing, and they can stay in transitional housing for their full time in the project, or they can stay in rapid rehousing, or they can start in TH and move to rapid rehousing. It is their choice. And it's the project's responsibility to have the resources to be able to provide those resources for any client who wants them, right? So if you have a THRH project, you have to be able to give any client who comes in either transitional housing or rapid rehousing, or both consecutively based on their choice. And then the maximum participation time for that client will be 24 months regardless of what project types they choose to participate in. I hope that was responsive and clear. Thanks. And Lisa, to your question, So there are no tiny homes that are COC funded transitional housing in Santa Clara County. And everything we're talking about is very specific to COC funding. The definitions of like transitional housing, interim housing, shelter get really fuzzy outside of a particular funding stream. But in this funding stream, there's no COC funded transitional housing in tiny homes. Yeah. Any other questions about any of these project types? All right, folks, I'm gonna propose a 2-minute break to be human. I know it's not a lot of time being human, but I encourage you to stand up, use the restroom, get a drink of water, and we will start back up at 2:03 exactly. So 2-minute stretch break, water break, feed your brains. All right, folks, come on back to your fascinating computer screens. I would like to share an update that I just learned, and it is the fact that my best friend's dog, Max, is a very good boy. And he went on a hike yesterday, and he was a very good boy. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is what can you pay for? We've talked about who you can serve, generally speaking. We've talked about general project types. In those projects, what are the types of activities that you can use this funding to pay for? It's federal funding, so we know that they have a lot of opinions and they care very much all of the specifics of what you spend this money on. So it's really important to understand those eligible costs. We won't be doing like a comprehensive look at eligible costs. I don't want you to come away with this feeling like you completely understand all of the costs that are eligible. I would again strongly recommend watching either a HUD training or training from another community or one of our trainings on eligible costs if that's what you're looking for. But we'll get a general sense of the types of things you can pay for. So the first piece is you can pay for housing costs in a variety of different ways. One option is tenant-based rental assistance. This is very much akin to other voucher type situations or rental subsidies that travel or follow with a client. The project will work with the client to identify a unit in the community somewhere that has a landlord, and the client will enter into a lease with for that unit, with that landlord, and the project will use rental assistance funding to pay part of that rent. For tenant-based rental assistance in permanent supportive housing, the client will also be paying up 30% of what is called their adjusted gross income. But it's important to note that if a client has zero adjusted gross income, they will be paying $0 because that's 30% of their adjusted gross income, right? So the portion of rent that the client is paying is based on their income, and the project is covering the rest of that rent. Tenant-based rental assistance, one of the key things here in this type of rental assistance is, of course, it follows the client, right? So the client and the project have to do a housing search. They have to engage landlords. They have to apply for a unit and be accepted in order to rent that unit. And then the project is helping the client pay for that particular unit. There is another type of rental assistance that's available called project-based rental assistance. In this situation, the rental assistance is tied to a specific unit or set of units. So the project would enter into an agreement with a landlord for a specific unit. The client would have a lease, but that lease would be with the project. So this is basically the project is using their rental assistance to pay the rent on a specific unit. The client is subleasing from the project, and again, the amount of rent that the client is paying versus the project is set for PSH by that 30% of adjusted gross income. And then finally, master leasing. Leasing dollars are a different type of housing cost that you can ask for. Leasing, in this situation, the project has a direct lease with a landlord, the client has a sublease, and the project is collecting rent directly from the client if they are choosing to collect rent. So these three types of funding are typically not combined in one project. You would choose for your particular project whether you want to do tenant-based rental assistance or project-based rental assistance or master leasing. You can also choose to not request any of these line items in your grant. So you can say, hey, HUD, we want our COC grant to only cover supportive services. At the same time, you still have to provide that housing assistance for your clients, right? So if you are not requesting rental assistance or leasing in your budget, you have to have other funding that is going to be providing the actual housing. So you either have to own housing or have other funding to cover the rental assistance or the leasing costs. There are a couple other less common ways of doing this. So for example, you could have housing that you own that is covering those housing costs. There's another type of rental assistance called sponsor-based rental assistance. If you're interested in the details of that, I can send you some materials. It's just, it's very unusual to use sponsor-based rental assistance, but it's not unheard of. It's sort of like it's almost the best short description I have. It's like doing leasing, but with rental assistance. It's very, very similar to leasing. So these are all of your funding options for your housing cost in a COC grant. The other, another major category of eligible costs is staff costs, services costs. So services costs often come in the form of personnel costs, staff costs, right? So you can pay for the time of case managers or social workers who are providing case management. You can pay for the time of other employees, full-time employees, part-time employees, contract, or you can pay by the hour for services. Any of the services that are eligible, and we'll go over that in a minute, but things like You know, you can hire a therapist to be on staff to serve your clients, or you can pay someone's costs of therapy, or you can connect them to therapy in a no-cost situation. But if you do need to use COC funding to pay for that, that staff time, that personnel time, you can. You can also use some program management and administration dollars. So you can pay for staff time who are doing certain very specific administrative tasks. That would be things like preparing your budget for your grant, complying with HUD's reporting requirements, doing an audit for your project or for your organization. There's a specific set of administrative activities that can be covered. So we talked about how you can pay for staff costs, or you can sort of pay for the costs of providing services from someone in the community. But what types of services, right? There's a specific set of service types that you can use this funding to provide. Case management is a big one, and you must provide case management to every client. Housing search. If you're not providing a specific housing unit, but you're supporting the client to find a unit on the market, you can use your COC grant to pay for that housing search assistance. Medical care, including behavioral health care, is eligible. Childcare, transportation, food, job training, education, legal services, right? All of this is covered. I want to call out here that it's really important to go and understand the specifics of each of these eligible categories. I have legal services up here on this slide, right? But there are specific restrictions and ways that you can pay for legal services that it's really important to understand. For example, there are specific types of legal services that you can pay for and specific types of legal services that you cannot pay for. One big and I think unfortunate example in terms of being able to serve our clients with this funding is you cannot pay for immigration related legal services with this funding, but there are other types of legal services that you can pay for. So, you know, it's important, and that's to a certain extent true for each of these categories, that there are specific details that you need to pay attention to, because not everything that seems to fall under one of these categories is actually eligible. Okay. Before we jump into other funding requirements, I'm going to see if there are any questions that we can answer about eligible costs. So I see a question in the chat, will SD costs be covered? Could you clarify what that means? That's an acronym I'm not familiar with. Security deposit, great, thank you. So for, yes, this funding can cover security deposits. For rental assistance and leasing, the rules are slightly different as they are just generally for rental assistance funding, leasing funding. But for the most part, you can cover security deposits up to, I believe, 2 months rent, something like that. But again, call back to, there are specific rules around that, but yes, it is eligible. Okay. In terms of food costs, are there guidelines or limitations on what types of foods? It's a great question. Not to my knowledge, no specific guidelines or limitations on what can be paid for. But I know that, like, I've had conversations with providers about how can I pay for those costs. So for example, like buying food versus reimbursing clients versus providing like Safeway gift cards and things like that. So definitely worth exploring, like, how do you actually do that? But as far as I know, there's no HUD guidelines about foods that they cannot be paid for. Yeah, great. So there, we have recorded compliance trainings. Our compliance trainings really get into, like, what are the very specific eligible costs? How do you determine if a cost is eligible? We have a very specific training on documenting client eligibility. We can send, in our follow-up email, we can send a link to where you can find those specific training recordings. Great, okay. I'm getting a lot of questions about specific costs. So yeah, we'll send a link to that eligible costs recording. But yeah, just quickly, the question about transportation costs in the chat, there are limitations on what transportation is acceptable. You cannot pay a client's car payments or buy a car for the client, but you can purchase a car for the organization that's used to transport clients to appointments. And for clients, transportation specifically, yes, public transportation, and where it is a reasonable and necessary expense, things like taxis. But more about that in the compliance training. Right, other funding requirements, because we're never done with the requirements for this funding. So these are just a few key requirements that we think it's important for y'all to know about as you're thinking about applying for this funding. One is the matching requirement. So if you receive a COC grant, in order to receive a COC grant, you have to be able to provide at least 25% of the equivalent of an amount that is equal to 25% of your COC grant in matching funds, which is funding from other sources. Those matching funds, right, that whatever amount you're designating as our match funding, it's not coming from your COC grant, it's coming from your agency revenue or another grant source or in-kind donations, whatever that is. But you have to use those matching funds on the things that would have been eligible for a COC grant. So those are additional funds that are restricted based on HUD's COC grant regulations. The match can be cash or in kind. That's another big question we get. So if you have, again, a therapist, I use that example a lot because it's such a common service need. So you can have therapists that donate their time, right? That's in kind. It could be match because mental health services are an eligible COC grant cost. But a basketball coach or another like sports activity coordinator for a project, excellent service, builds community, increases health and well-being, not an eligible COC grant cost, so could not be a match source. So as an example here, if you have a COC grant, you've got rental assistance, supportive services, and admin in your grant, and you have about $198,000 total grant funding. That means that your match requirement you need to meet is 25% times $198,000. And so you would have to be able to find at least $49,500 of match. That is either cash or in-kind services that meet those eligible cost categories. The last thing to note is that leasing funds don't need to be matched. So if instead of $100,000 of rental assistance, you requested $100,000 of leasing, because that was the project design you wanted to do, you would only have $98,000 that you would need to match instead of the whole $198,000. I'm not sure why, but that's just how it is. And another great example of those really intricate rules that it's good to pay attention to. We have other resources on matching funds if you'd like more information on this as well. There we go. Another requirement of COC grant for COC grants is that you do participate in the HMIS, or the Homeless Management Information System. This is the local community-wide database that collects client-level information. So for each client, you would need to request a client release of information to allow you to enter their information into HMIS. I want to make it very clear that if a client tells you you have a COC funded project and the client says, I don't want you to put any of my information into HMIS, I do not release my information, that is their right and that is okay, and you would still enroll them in the project. And we can work with you on what that means for HMIS. It's not a super common occurrence. And for the most part, you will be collecting information for everybody who is in your project, but don't want to make it seem like they have to release their information in order to receive services. But generally, you would get that release of information form that they would sign saying, yes, you can enter my information into HMIS. Then you would collect specific pieces of client information at the client's entry into the project, and then annually as they're in the project thereafter, and then when they exit. And you would enter that data into HMIS as promptly and as timely a fashion as possible. HMIS data quality is one of the expectations of our local continuum of care for projects. So there are various ways that HMIS data is, that you can monitor your HMIS data by running data quality reports. And this is also one of the things that is evaluated in that local annual competition to assess which projects are going to be submitted to HUD for funding. So HMIS data quality is one of several priorities of the continuum of care. Another expectation of our continuum of care for projects is that projects are operated in a housing first approach with a housing first philosophy. At its core, housing first just says that everyone who is unhoused is ready to be housed. Homelessness is an issue of not having housing, so providing housing should be the key and first step. To make it a little bit more concrete, with a housing first approach in a project, you would just want to make sure you're not adding any additional barriers to access to a project, right? So requiring that someone have income before accessing a project, or requiring that someone be sober before entering a project, or screening people out because of a criminal record or because they have experienced domestic violence. All of these would be contrary to housing first, right? You want to make sure that anybody who is at a baseline eligible for your project is able to be enrolled in your project. And then once someone is enrolled in a project, this gets back to a question we had in the chat, right? We want to make sure that we're not kicking people out for reasons that are not essential, right? We want to try to make exiting from a project a true last resort, and very, very rare. So if someone is not participating in supportive services, that is not a reason for exiting them from a project. If they're not making progress in the way that they need to in order to maintain independent housing stability, that's still not a reason to exit them from a project. If they have an emergency and lose all of their income and start back over from zero income, that's not a reason to exit them from a project. Or being in a continuous experience of domestic violence, refusing to disengage from an abuser is not a reason to exit someone from a project, right? That's a reason to work with them to maintain safety for both themselves and the other participants in the project, but not a reason for exiting. So housing first in the COC program world is lowering barriers. And great question, Daniel. So the question is, what are possible reasons to exit someone? We have a community-wide set of policies and procedures called the Quality Assurance Standards. And the Quality Assurance Standards include the COC's client termination and grievance policies. And they lay out the expectations for client termination. And I think we can link, in our follow-up email, we'll link to the QAS and give you the page for that. Our last piece here is about how do you apply for this funding? Or what does the timeline look like at the very least? The notice of funding availability, or now it's called the notice of funding opportunity. So you might hear me or other people jump back and forth between Nofa and Nofo. But that weird acronym refers to the written notice that HUD releases to let us know that the competition for this year is starting. When does that happen? We don't know. We never know. It just happens when it happens. It's very exciting. We get to wait all spring to see when it's going to happen. But we do get started preparing for the release of this notice pretty early in the year, because there's a lot of prep we need in order to be able to conduct the local competition in order to submit our applications to HUD. So we start by reviewing and often revising our scoring, our selection process for our local competition. That process of developing our scoring criteria and our scoring process is going on. It's starting this month. And we invite all of you to participate in the Nofa or Nofo Committee meetings that will be looking at how are we evaluating existing projects? How are we going to be scoring new project applications in the coming year? And then that scoring process is approved each year by the COC board. And then once we've approved our scoring process for the year, we start collecting information from our existing grantees, because all of our existing grants are scored each year as well and evaluated. So we'll have to get some information from those existing grants that we're going to use to score them. And then we have an initial, what we call a pre-Nofa or pre-Nofo review and rank panel, where we do a little bit of this scoring and evaluation ahead of time just for renewal projects. This is purely because of how heavy a lift the scoring is. So instead of having our scoring panel meet for an entire week, 8 hours a day during the Nofa competition period, we pull out some of the stuff we can score ahead of time for renewal projects and score it early. So if you hear about a pre-Nofa process, that means just for renewal projects, we have some of their information already. We're doing a little bit of scoring ahead of time to get it out of the way. And then the notice is released. So exciting. So I mentioned we never know this when this happens. In pre-COVID years, we were getting into a rhythm of seeing the Nofo come out in late June, early to mid-July. Last year, the notice came out pretty late. I think it was September or October, if I remember correctly. We don't know what it's going to look like this year. We're hoping for it to be more in that June, July range, but honestly, we have no idea when it will come out. But once it does, we'll let you all know. We'll say, hey, the notice of funding availability is out. At some point after the Nofa is released, HUD will make the funding application available in their federal funding system, and they'll set a deadline for us to finish our local decision about which projects we're going to submit. And they'll also set a due date for our total application. So what will we do after the Nofa is released? We will conduct a TA workshop, which we invite anybody who's interested in this funding to come to the TA workshop and to learn about the application for this year and the funding that's available for this particular year. Then all of the local applicants submit a local application. There is a local review and selection process and an appeals process for all of those applicants. We have one last meeting of the Nofa Committee to take a look at the list of projects that have come out of that scoring process. And then the COC board approves our list of projects for submission to HUD. All through this process, Homebase will support applicants to edit and finalize their actual HUD request for funding, right? Which is something that is sent to HUD. So we want to make sure that it's all accurate and eligible. And we're there to support you with that process. So I know that was really quick, but I'm going to move on to wrap up. I want to remind you what's next, because I imagine that if I were you, I would be feeling like, this is all a lot of information. I do not yet feel ready to even decide whether I want to apply for this funding. Totally fair. So what's next? First, I want to highlight the Nofo Committee, right? I mentioned that process of designing our scoring tools and our evaluation criteria for this year's competition is starting this month. The first Nofo Committee meeting is on February 17th. Announcements and invitations to those meetings are sent out on the COC listserv and the SPN listserv. So if you were on one of those lists and you got an announcement about this meeting, you should get the announcements about those meetings. If you haven't seen it and you want to come and you want the information, just email us at santaclaracoc@homebaseccc.org. I also want to remind you that we will have opportunities to continue learning about COC program funding and funding applications. The Intro to Project Design session, these are not scheduled yet, but they should happen in the spring, this spring. Intro to Project Design will break out the big decision points, like who am I going to serve, and help walk through and workshop how you're making that decision and what your options are. What project type do I want to have? What pieces of funding am I going to ask for? And then how am I going to cover my match and things like that? And then the Intro to Project applications will be, again, walking through both our local application form and the HUD application form so that you've seen it and have some understanding of it before you dive into this very quick application period that happens when the Nofa is released. So that is our time. And I hope that we were able to answer most questions. If you have any additional questions or want to be hooked up to the COC or SPN listservs, or just want to chat about this funding, let us know. Our email address is on the screen. Again, santaclaracoc@homebasedccc.org. I really appreciate you all being here today and your interest in this funding.